Who dictates the value of your life? Is it the people around you, the society that constantly watches and judges, or is it something deeper within you? In a world where our every action can be posted, liked, shared, and picked apart by strangers, it's no wonder so many of us feel like we're constantly performing, constantly trying to prove something. We chase approval like it's oxygen, terrified of being overlooked, rejected, or forgotten. But the truth is, most people aren't watching as closely as we think. They're too busy with their own worries, their own insecurities, their own performances. And that realization, while uncomfortable at first, is actually liberating. Because if nobody's really keeping score, then maybe you can stop living for the scoreboard. Maybe you can finally start living for what matters. That's the core of Stoic wisdom, not to numb yourself from life, but to reclaim control over how you live it. You don't need applause to be at peace. You need integrity. You need alignment with your own values. And when you start grounding yourself in what you know to be right, rather than what others expect, you begin to build a life that no one else can shake. If these conversations speak to something real in you, something grounded in truth, philosophy, and inner growth, consider subscribing. It's a small gesture, but it helps us reach more minds like yours, and it quietly signals that you're walking this path with intention. 1. The silent addiction to attention. We don't think of it as addiction, but that's what it is. Not in the traditional sense of a substance or chemical, but in the way our brains silently crave validation. We open our phones and wait for a like, a message, a quick burst of digital applause that says, "You're seen, you're valuable." It feels harmless at first, even rewarding, but the moment it doesn't come, when the post gets ignored, when the screen stays quiet, we shrink, doubt ourselves, rethink who we are based on what we didn't get from someone who might not even know us. That's the trap. It's a cycle that keeps spinning, quietly convincing you that your value lives somewhere out there, floating in the eyes of others. But who told you that your worth is tied to their reaction? Who convinced you that silence is rejection? You see, attention feels like substance. It feels solid, like it means something. But really, it's vapor, a momentary high, a shallow echo. And like any high, it fades fast. You crash, then you chase again. Stoic philosophy saw this pattern centuries ago and called it what it is: illusion. It teaches us that our worth is not a mirror reflecting others' opinions. It's not something we borrow, it's something we own. Marcus Aurelius, writing in the solitude of his own reflection, said, "It never ceases to amaze me. We all love ourselves more than other people, but care more about their opinions than our own." That contradiction is at the heart of our suffering. We claim to value ourselves, but we act like spectators hold the scorecard to our identity. We hand them our self-worth like it's theirs to validate or erase. But they're not even watching. Most people are too absorbed in their own fears and judgments to obsess over yours. The crowd you think is watching? They're just trying to keep their own heads above water. Carl Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But you can't do that while looking sideways, constantly adjusting yourself to fit someone else's lens. When we let our identity be shaped by public opinion, we become fragmented. We start playing roles, wearing masks, trading truth for approval. And in the process, we lose sight of something essential: ourselves. This is why the Stoics spoke of building an inner citadel, a mental fortress where your peace, your purpose, your values remain untouched by outside forces. It's not about isolating from the world. It's about no longer needing the world to tell you who you are. Aristotle believed that virtue, character in action, was the essence of a good life. Not status, not applause, but choosing the right action for the right reason. That kind of clarity doesn't come from external noise. It comes from inner alignment. You begin to feel it when you choose honesty over attention, when you create, not for likes, but because it's meaningful, when you walk away from what looks good to others in favor of what feels right to you. These small acts, repeated with intention, build a foundation far sturdier than public opinion. Plato wrote about the danger of living in shadows, mistaking illusions for truth. That's exactly what external validation can become, a shadow. It looks real, it looks important, but it's hollow. It can't sustain you. It can't nourish your soul, because the approval that matters most is the one that comes when you look at yourself, quietly, honestly, and feel at peace. Not because you're perfect, but because you were real, because you didn't bend just to be liked, because you chose self-respect over self-promotion. The more you return to yourself, the more you realize how much you've been outsourcing your peace. And once you see that clearly, you can't unsee it. You start pulling back the energy you once gave away. You stop trying to impress and start trying to align. And slowly, your sense of worth becomes less reactive and more rooted. It becomes less about who applauds and more about whether you can stand by your own choices. That shift, subtle as it is, changes everything. Socrates once said, "The unexamined life is not worth living." And in this context, the unexamined approval is not worth chasing. When you stop performing and start reflecting, you begin to live on your own terms. That's not arrogance, that's freedom. And it's the only kind of freedom worth building. 2. Why rejection hurts so much. Do you know why it stings when someone ignores you? When they unfollow, unfriend, leave your message on read. That quiet moment after, where the silence feels louder than any words, can feel like a judgment, like you've done something wrong. But what if that pain isn't really about them at all? What if it's a signal pointing inward? Because somewhere deep down, you've started to believe that being acknowledged means being worthy, that being seen means being enough. So when someone turns away, it doesn't just feel like they left. It feels like they saw you and decided you weren't enough to stay for. That's where it gets dangerous. That's where self-worth gets tangled up in someone else's gaze. And that's the belief Stoic philosophy urges us to challenge at its roots. You are not here to be validated. You're here to live with virtue. And virtue, according to the Stoics, is not handed to you by others. It's something you cultivate in your thoughts, actions, and values. The moment you begin to tie your value to someone else's response, you give away your power. That's not just a philosophical idea, it's a psychological reality. Carl Jung once said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." And it is terrifying, because it means facing the truth that you may not always be liked. You may be rejected, and still you remain whole. When you ground yourself in that understanding, rejection loses its grip. It no longer defines you. It simply passes by, like a wave breaking on rock. Rejection in its rawest form only hurts when you've placed your self-worth on rented land, on opinions you can't control, and control is key here. Stoicism teaches us to separate the world into two categories: what's within our control and what isn't. Other people's reactions, choices, and feelings, always outside your reach. But how you respond, how you choose to interpret the silence or the distance, that's yours, always was, always will be. The moment you reclaim that power, something shifts. You begin to realize that someone's disinterest is not a verdict on your worth, it's just a reflection of their own perspective, shaped by things you'll never fully know. Plato once wrote that, "Opinion is the medium between knowledge and ignorance." And that's what most judgment is: opinion, fleeting, incomplete. sometimes thoughtless, certainly not truth. When you live for someone else's approval, you build your life on unstable ground. You become reactive. You twist yourself to fit molds that weren't designed for you. And eventually, you forget who you were before the need to impress ever took hold. But when you let go of that, when you return to yourself and ask, am I living by my own values? Am I being honest, kind, just? You begin to rebuild from the inside. Aristotle believed that the good life is found in living with excellence, not perfection, but the steady pursuit of being better, wiser, truer. That pursuit doesn't require applause, it requires integrity. And that is something no rejection can take from you. So yes, it hurts when people walk away. It hurts when you're left out, left behind, or dismissed. But that pain is not proof that something is wrong with you. It's proof that you've been conditioned to believe your value comes from the outside in instead of the inside out. The work, then, is not to numb yourself to rejection, but to understand it, to see it clearly and say, this doesn't belong to me. And slowly, you begin to free yourself. Not from connection or care, but from dependency on what was never yours to control. Socrates once said, know thyself. Not be approved by others, not be followed or praised, just know. And in knowing, choose to walk your path, even when others don't walk with you. That's where real peace lives. That's where freedom begins. 3. The illusion of being watched. It feels like the world is watching, doesn't it? Like every move you make, every word you speak is being weighed and measured by some invisible jury. You post something online and hesitate, wondering how it will be received, how it will be judged. You speak in a group and immediately second-guess yourself. Did I sound stupid? Was that too much? That constant inattention, the pressure to be perfect, to say the right thing, to never mess up, can feel suffocating. But here's the truth that most of us forget. That feeling isn't reality. It's the voice of your ego gently whispering that you're the main character in everyone else's story. It convinces you that your flaws are magnified, your mistakes unforgettable, and your missteps being kept on some cosmic scoreboard. But the truth, most people aren't even paying attention. They're not thinking about your awkward laugh, or the post you deleted, or the time you said something a little off. They're thinking about themselves, about how they look, how they sounded, how they are being judged. And once you let that truth settle in, it changes everything. It's humbling to realize how little people are actually thinking about you, but it's also liberating, because if no one is really keeping score, then what are you so afraid of? Why keep holding yourself back out of fear of judgment that may not even exist? Carl Jung once said, "The greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parents." But today, that burden looks a little different. It's the unlived life we carry because we're still performing, for strangers, for peers, for ghosts that live in our imagination. Nobody's waiting for you to impress them. Nobody's building a case against you in their mind. And that means you're free. Free to mess up. Free to try things that might not work. Free to be honest even when it's awkward. When you stop imagining an audience, you start living like the stage is actually yours. Seneca said, "We suffer more in imagination than in reality." And it's true. Most of the pain you feel from being watched or judged is a story your mind has written without checking the facts. The truth is, the silence after your mistake is just silence. The glance you misread is just a glance. Most of it doesn't mean what you think it means. Once you realize that, fear starts to lose its grip. This doesn't mean that nothing matters. It means that the right things matter more. Your growth, your effort, your truth. When you no longer live for applause, you begin to build for longevity. You start choosing what's meaningful over what's performative. Plato once wrote that the soul becomes confused when it tries to see itself through the opinions of others. And that confusion is everywhere today. We edit our lives, curate our identities, perform rather than express. And slowly, without even noticing, we stop living for ourselves. But the moment you step back from that performance, the moment you stop checking who's watching, you start to feel something you haven't felt in a long time. Space, breathing room, the freedom to just exist without needing to be approved. That's the space where real creativity lives, real confidence, real connection, not the kind based on image, but the kind based on truth. Socrates said, "To find yourself, think for yourself." But how can you think for yourself if you're always wondering what everyone else is thinking of you? The answer is, you can't. You have to let go, not out of rebellion, but out of wisdom. Because when you stop performing, you gain access to something far more powerful than praise. You gain the ability to act with integrity, to make choices that align with your values, to fail and still feel whole. That's not recklessness, it's freedom. And it's only possible when you stop living for an audience that doesn't exist. 4. Inner peace doesn't perform. If you're living for applause, you'll never rest. Because the moment you start chasing approval, you hand over the steering wheel of your life. Suddenly, you're not moving from your own clarity, but from other people's reactions. You start second-guessing your words, adjusting your style, calculating how each decision might land in the eyes of others. It's subtle at first, harmless even, but over time, it becomes exhausting. You turn into a version of yourself that's constantly rehearsing, smiling when you don't feel like it, agreeing when something inside you says no. And the worst part? Most of the time, the applause doesn't even come. Or when it does, it's fleeting. It's never enough. So you try again, stretch further, bend more, hoping that this time they'll notice you, appreciate you, accept you. But applause is loud and short. It echoes, then vanishes. And if you've built your identity on that sound, what's left when the room goes quiet? This is where inner peace begins to feel like a distant idea. Because peace doesn't perform. It doesn't put on a mask. It doesn't seek approval. Peace just is, quiet, grounded, steady. It lives in the places that don't need an audience. It shows up when you're aligned with who you are, not with who others want you to be. But reaching that kind of peace requires something radical in today's world. Letting go of the show, turning away from the stage, choosing to live in a way that may not always look impressive, but feels deeply real. Socrates once said, "The greatest way to live with honor in this world is to be what we pretend to be." And maybe that's the work, to stop pretending and start becoming. Ask yourself, honestly, would I still make this choice if no one ever saw it? If there were no photos, no comments, no spotlight, would I still wear this, speak this, do this? The answer to that question can tell you more about your inner life than any amount of attention ever could. Because when the answer is yes, when your actions align with your own values and not someone else's expectations, that's peace. That's integrity. And in a world where everyone's chasing recognition, choosing peace is an act of quiet rebellion. Carl Jung believed that wholeness for humans depends on the integration of the self, not the version of you that pleases others, but the one you face when you're alone. And that integration doesn't happen when you're busy being everything for everyone. It happens in the moments when you stop, when you sit with your discomfort, when you admit that the performance isn't fulfilling you anymore. That's when things start to shift. You begin to strip away the layers that were built for display, and you start remembering who you were before the noise got so loud. Living in alignment doesn't mean you stop caring about others. It means you stop betraying yourself for their comfort. Aristotle taught that the highest good is not pleasure or honor, but a life of virtue, of living in accordance with reason. That kind of life requires courage, because it asks you to choose what's right over what's popular. It asks you to walk away from validation when it comes at the cost of your peace. And it demands that you stay grounded even when the world is spinning with opinions. There will always be moments when the applause is tempting, when attention feels like love and silence feels like rejection. But when you've cultivated inner alignment, when you've built a relationship with yourself that doesn't depend on who's clapping, you can withstand those moments. You can smile, stay centered, and continue forward, not for applause, but for purpose. Plato wrote that the first and best victory is to conquer self. And maybe the first step in that victory is simply choosing to stop performing and start living. Not louder, but truer. Not to impress, but to align. Because the life that's lived for show will always feel hollow. But the life lived in quiet truth, that's where peace finally finds a home. 5. Own your path, or be dragged. You can't walk two roads, not at the same time, and you can't live your life while trying to live someone else's too. That's the trap, trying to balance between your truth and their expectations, between who you are and who the world wants you to be. It starts small. You adjust a little here, bend a little there. You choose what sounds safe, what looks good, what earns you a nod of approval. But slowly, quietly, piece by piece, you drift. You look in the mirror and don't recognize what's looking back, because you've spent so long becoming what they admire, what they value, what they expect, that you forgot what you believe. The Stoics understood this danger well. That's why they spoke of the inner citadel, a protected space inside you, untouched by noise, by pressure, by praise. It's not built by accident, it's forged through choice, through small acts of courage, through living by your values, not their preferences. That kind of living doesn't always look impressive from the outside. In fact, it often goes unnoticed, because it's quiet, it's steady, it doesn't try to win the crowd, it tries to win back your soul. Carl Jung once wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But how many of us even get close to that? Becoming who you truly are requires something most people avoid: solitude, not loneliness. Solitude, there's a difference. Loneliness is the ache of disconnection. Solitude is the strength of presence. It's where you meet yourself again. And it's uncomfortable at first, because when the world goes quiet, all the things you've been avoiding start to speak. The doubts, the questions, the forgotten values. But it's also in that silence where clarity is born. That's where your inner citadel starts to take shape. And the truth is, if you don't claim your path, someone else will hand you theirs. That's the nature of the world. It always has a plan for you. Parents, peers, algorithms, culture, they'll gladly map your life for you if you're not paying attention. But that map rarely leads to peace. It leads to performance, to fitting in, to success by someone else's standards. Socrates once said, "To find yourself, think for yourself." And thinking for yourself isn't always loud or flashy. Sometimes it's walking away from what everyone else is chasing. Sometimes it's standing still while the world rushes by. It's uncomfortable, but it's also where you start to build a life that belongs to you, not just a version of you that pleases others. Aristotle taught that virtue lies in acting with purpose, in finding the balance between extremes. And there's wisdom in that balance, not between who you are and who they want you to be, but between courage and caution, between solitude and connection, between dreaming and grounding. That balance is personal. You don't find it in the applause. You find it in the moments where no one's watching and you still choose what's right. In the choices that make you proud, even if they don't make you popular. You don't need to rebel against everything to find your path. You just need to be honest. Honest about what matters to you. Honest about the weight of constantly performing. And honest about the cost of abandoning yourself just to belong. Because the truth is, nothing you gain from pretending will ever feel as good as the peace that comes from being real. Plato believed the soul suffers when it's pulled in too many directions, and you can feel that suffering when you try to be everything to everyone. But the moment you turn inward, the moment you begin to align with your own values, that suffering starts to ease. Not because life gets easier, but because you get clearer. The inner citadel isn't built overnight. It's built choice by choice, moment by moment. It's built in the way you show up when no one's applauding, in the way you say no to things that don't align, even when it would be easier to say yes. And most of all, it's built in your commitment to walk your road, your one, honest, imperfect, deeply human road, even when others don't understand it. Because at the end of the day, the only path worth walking is the one that brings you back to yourself. And if you don't fight to stay on it, you'll wake up one day walking someone else's life, wondering where yours went. 6. Nobody cares, and that's beautiful. What happens when you finally accept it? That nobody's really watching? That the judgment you've been bracing for, the criticism you've imagined in every quiet pause, never truly mattered the way you thought it did? Something shifts. Deep inside, you start to breathe differently. You start to move differently. There's a kind of freedom that settles in, not loud or showy, but steady, grounded, real. You begin to live, not in the way that's carefully edited for approval, but in a way that feels like coming home to yourself. Every choice becomes a reflection of what you truly value, not what others expect. You speak more clearly, not because you've rehearsed, but because you no longer fear getting it wrong. You start to write your story the way it was meant to be written, without trimming the edges just to fit someone else's frame. And that's when something even more powerful happens. You begin to sleep better. Not because the world clapped, but because you did. Because your day aligned with your values, not their opinions. Stoicism has always pointed us toward this kind of freedom, not by teaching us to suppress our emotions, but by helping us understand them, by showing us where our power ends and where our peace begins. The Stoics never asked us to be cold or detached. They asked us to see clearly, to understand that so much of our suffering doesn't come from what happens, but from how we interpret it. Seneca once said, "We are more often frightened than hurt, and we suffer more from imagination than from reality." And when you step out of that imagined spotlight, when you stop living as if the world is constantly evaluating your worth, you begin to feel something unfamiliar: stillness. And in that stillness, there's clarity. Carl Jung believed that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. That fear of being seen, that craving for approval, it often lives in the unconscious. It shapes our choices in quiet ways. But the moment you become aware of it, the moment you see how much of your life has been about performance, you get to choose differently. You get to reclaim the parts of you that were hidden for safety. You begin to express, not impress. And while that might not draw as much attention, it draws something more meaningful: self-respect. Living this way isn't always easy. The world is still loud. It still rewards the polished version, the curated highlight reel. But what it rarely offers is peace. And peace only comes when your actions align with your inner compass. Aristotle spoke of eudaimonia, the highest form of happiness, not as fleeting pleasure but as a deep sense of flourishing that comes from living in accordance with virtue. That kind of life isn't built overnight. It's built moment by moment, in the quiet decisions no one sees. The ones where you choose to speak honestly rather than say what's popular. Where you stay still when rushing ahead would impress others. Where you walk your path, even when it's misunderstood. Plato reminded us that the soul is harmed when it lives in contradiction, and that's what happens when you say one thing but believe another. When you pretend for approval but ache for authenticity. It's exhausting. It wears down the spirit. But the good news is, you can stop. You can choose a different rhythm, one that honors who you are, not just who others want you to be. That choice doesn't make life easier, but it makes it real, and there's power in that. The moment you stop needing to be seen is the moment you truly begin to see yourself. Not through the lens of how others react, but through the quiet strength of knowing you're showing up as you. And that's enough. Maybe not for everyone, but for you. And that's the only audience that ever mattered. You don't need to be seen to be whole. You don't need applause to live a life that's meaningful. The quiet moments, the honest choices, the integrity no one notices, that's where your strength is built. So keep showing up for yourself, even when no one's watching. If this message stayed with you, there's more waiting. Watch one of the suggested videos on your screen to keep walking this path of reflection and inner growth. Thank you for being here, truly. And thank you for spending this time here. Until next time, stay grounded, live simply, and keep choosing the life that belongs to you.